It was a cold, windy night when I arrived at the old family cabin deep in the woods. The place had been abandoned for years, ever since my grandparents passed away. They had left it to my parents, but neither of them wanted anything to do with it. Now, after their passing, it was my turn to decide what to do with the cabin. I decided to spend a night there, hoping to relive some childhood memories before putting it on the market. The cabin was exactly as I remembered it. The creaky wooden floors, the musty smell of aged wood, and the old photographs hanging crookedly on the walls. I spent the afternoon cleaning up, trying to make the place a bit more hospitable for the night. As the sun set, I lit a fire in the stone hearth and settled into an armchair with a book. Around midnight, just as I was about to head to bed, I heard it. A faint, rhythmic tapping coming from beneath the floorboards. I froze, straining my ears to catch the sound again. Tap, tap, tap. It was unmistakable. I tried to convince myself it was just the old house settling or a rodent scurrying around, but the pattern was too deliberate, too human. I grabbed a flashlight and cautiously made my way to the basement door. The hinges groaned in protest as I opened it, revealing a steep, narrow staircase descending into darkness. Taking a deep breath, I started down, each step creaking ominously under my weight. The basement was colder than the rest of the house, and the air was damp and heavy. I swept the flashlight beam around, illuminating stacks of old boxes, rusting tools, and forgotten furniture draped in dusty sheets. But nothing that could explain the tapping. Then I saw it. A small wooden door at the far end of the basement, partially hidden behind a stack of crates. The tapping was louder here, more insistent. Tap, tap, tap. My heart pounded in my chest as I approached the door, my hand trembling as I reached for the rusted handle. The door swung open with a loud creak, revealing a dark, narrow tunnel that seemed to stretch on forever. The tapping was louder now, echoing down the tunnel with an eerie, hollow sound. I took a step inside, the flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The walls were rough-hewn stone, damp and covered in patches of mold. The air was colder here, biting into my skin. I followed the sound, my breath coming in short, nervous gasps. The tunnel seemed to go on forever, twisting and turning in impossible ways. Just when I thought I would never find the source, I saw it. A small wooden box lying on the ground, partially buried in dirt. The tapping was coming from inside. With shaking hands, I knelt down and opened the box. Inside was a doll, old and worn, with porcelain skin and glass eyes that seemed to stare straight into my soul. The doll's tiny hand was tapping against the side of the box, moving on its own accord. Tap, tap, tap. I recoiled in horror, dropping the flashlight. It rolled away, casting wild shadows on the walls. The doll's eyes seemed to follow the light, and I could have sworn I saw its lips move, forming silent words. My skin crawled, and a chill ran down my spine. Suddenly the tapping stopped, and the tunnel was plunged into an oppressive silence. I fumbled for the flashlight, my fingers brushing against the cold, damp ground. When I finally grasped it and turned it back on, the doll was gone. I scrambled to my feet and ran back the way I came, the darkness closing in around me. My footsteps echoed loudly, and I could hear whispers, faint and indistinct, following me through the tunnel. The air grew colder, and I felt an unseen presence closing in. I burst out of the tunnel and slammed the basement door shut behind me, my heart racing. The whispers faded, but the sense of dread lingered. I hurried upstairs, grabbed my belongings, and fled the cabin, not daring to look back. To this day, I don't know what I encountered in that old cabin. The doll, the tunnel, the whispers, none of it made any sense. I sold the property as soon as I could and never spoke of it again. But sometimes in the dead of night I hear it, a faint rhythmic tapping coming from beneath the floorboards. It was a rainy, stormy night when I arrived home from a late shift at the hospital. Exhausted, I kicked off my shoes and tossed my wet coat onto the rack. My small suburban house was quiet, the only sound the steady drumming of rain against the windows. I turned on the living room light, its warm glow casting familiar shadows, and collapsed onto the couch, ready to doze off right there. Just as I was drifting off, a sharp knock on the door jolted me awake. I checked the clock. 2:47 a.m. Who could be visiting at this hour and in such weather? I approached the door cautiously, peering through the peephole. A tall, thin figure stood on the porch, their face obscured by the shadows of their hooded raincoat. "Who is it?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "Please, I need help." A woman's voice responded, trembling with urgency. I hesitated for a moment, but the desperation in her voice compelled me to act. I unlocked the door and opened it a crack. The woman looked drenched and shivered from the cold. Her eyes, wide with fear, locked onto mine. "Please, can I come in?" she begged. "There's something out there." I stepped aside, letting her in. She immediately collapsed onto the floor, panting and soaked to the bone. I rushed to get her a towel and a blanket. As I handed them to her, I noticed deep scratches on her arms and legs. "What happened to you?" I asked, concern overriding my exhaustion. "I was driving home when my car broke down," she explained between gasps. "I decided to walk, but then something started following me. It was like a shadow, but alive." A chill ran down my spine. The storm outside seemed to intensify, the wind howling around the house. I tried to reassure her, even as a creeping sense of dread began to settle over me. "You're safe here," I said. "I'll call for help." I picked up my phone, but the signal was dead. Typical in a storm like this. I decided to wait it out until morning when the weather would likely clear. I offered her a hot drink, and she nodded gratefully. I made my way to the kitchen, but just as I was about to start the kettle, the power went out, plunging the house into darkness. From the living room, I heard a soft, almost imperceptible whisper. My heart raced as I grabbed a flashlight from a drawer and rushed back. The beam of light revealed the woman sitting on the floor, staring at the window. Her eyes were wide with terror. "It's here," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the storm. I turned the flashlight towards the window, and there it was, a dark, indistinct figure standing just outside, its form barely visible through the rain-streaked glass. It was tall and impossibly thin, with long, spindly arms that seemed to blend into the shadows. Panic surged through me. I quickly locked all the doors and windows, double-checking each one. When I returned to the living room, the woman was gone. I called out for her, but there was no response. My flashlight flickered, and for a moment the room was plunged into darkness. When the light stabilized, she was there, standing in the corner, her back to me. "Are you okay?" I asked, approaching cautiously. She turned slowly, her eyes now dark and empty, void of any humanity. Her mouth twisted into a chilling grin. "Thank you for letting me in," she said, her voice now an eerie echo. I stumbled back, my mind reeling. The shadow outside the window seemed to seep through the walls, merging with her form. She advanced slowly, her movements unnatural and jerky, like a puppet on invisible strings. Desperately, I backed away, my flashlight flickering wildly. I reached for my phone again, hoping for a miracle, but it was still dead. The figure that had once been a woman was now almost upon me, her cold, dark eyes locking onto mine with a predatory intensity. In a final act of desperation, I grabbed a fire poker from beside the hearth and swung it at her. It passed through her like smoke, and she laughed, a hollow, chilling sound that echoed through the house. "You can't hurt me," she hissed. "You invited me in." Her hand shot out, cold and clammy, gripping my wrist with unearthly strength. I felt a wave of numbness spread from her touch, paralyzing me. The shadows around her swirled and writhed, enveloping me in their cold embrace. Just as I felt myself slipping into unconsciousness, the first light of dawn broke through the storm clouds, piercing the darkness. The shadow recoiled, and the woman let out a scream, her form dissolving into the morning light. I collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath. When I finally regained my strength, the house was empty, and the storm had passed. The scratches on my arm were the only evidence that the nightmare had been real. Shaken, I packed a bag and left, vowing never to return. The memory of that night haunts me still, and every time I hear a knock at the door, I remember her chilling words. "You invited me in." It was a cold, quiet night when I pulled into the parking lot of the deserted gas station. I hadn't been sleeping well since my sister vanished without a trace 6 months ago, and these late-night drives had become a routine. The place was eerily empty as I approached the counter. I noticed a young man standing there, looking to be in his early 20s, with scruffy hair and a stained uniform. His eyes darted around nervously, and his hands twitched as he fiddled with the register. "Excuse me, can I get some gas?" I asked. He didn't respond at first, his eyes moving left to right really fast. When he finally looked at me, his pupils had suddenly turned a milky white. I stumbled back, heart pounding in my chest. "Sir, are you okay?" His eyes cleared and he blinked rapidly as if coming out of a trance. "Sorry about that. What can I get for you?" His voice was eerily familiar, and it sent chills down my spine. I shook my head, trying to focus. $20 on pump 3, please." He tapped at the register, his movements jerky and unnatural. Then he paused, a strange smile creeping across his face. "Hey sis, still miss me?" My blood ran cold. My sister Lucy used to call me sis in the same exact tone when she was being playful. Lucy, who had disappeared 6 months ago without a trace. "What did you say?" The young man at the counter looked up, his eyes strange and dark. I took a step back. "Is this a joke? Are you one of her friends?" His face contorted into a sinister grin. "Don't you remember? The last time you saw me, you were crying, begging me to stay." My heart nearly stopped. My sister had run away after a huge argument with our parents. The last time I saw her, she was storming out of the house while I begged her to come back. Seeing this man mimic her words and mannerisms so perfectly, right down to the chilling details no one knew, was too much to bear. "This isn't funny. Please stop, you're not her." Tears streamed down my face. He leaned over the counter, his eyes dark and menacing. The young man laughed, a cold, hollow sound, and as he did that, the lights in the station started going on and off. "I think you owe me an apology." With that, his hand leapt out and grabbed my neck, choking with unholy force. I kicked the counter with everything I had and pushed myself away. That is when he leapt and jumped on the counter, sticking his tongue out, his teeth now morphed into sharp, razor ones. He grabbed my arm with one hand and punched at my shoulder with the other. Pain shot through my body as he went on to twist my hand, and soon I could hear the bones cracking. I cried out, trying to pull away, but he held on tight. "I think you owe me an apology," he hissed. I struggled, kicking and thrashing, but he was relentless. He dragged me across the floor, his eyes glowing with a malevolent light. I felt my strength fading, my vision blurring. Just as I thought I couldn't take any more, I whispered, "I'm sorry, Lucy. I love you. Please forgive me." Suddenly he stopped. His grip loosened and he stepped back, his expression blank. I had been the last person to see my sister before she disappeared. I never got to tell her how sorry I was for everything until that moment. The lights suddenly flickered again, and when they steadied, the young man was gone. In his place was a terrified clerk, his eyes wide with confusion. "What happened?" "Are you okay, Mom?" he asked, his voice trembling. I lay on the floor, my body aching, tears still streaming down my face. The clerk helped me to my feet and offered to call an ambulance. I stumbled out of the station, holding on to my broken hand, the cold night air hitting my face like a slap. I looked back one last time, half expecting to see Lucy standing there, her eyes filled with anger and pain. But the place was empty. I just hoped that she found peace wherever she was.